Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, whatever time zone you're listening to this in. I am Jaboa Miranda, and you're listening to In Her Blazer podcast, which is a podcast that talks about everything business and everything women in a very vulnerable way. We're joined by a fantastic person here today, and I will get to this amazing person in a second. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jaboa Miranda. I'm a keynote speaker on mental toughness, company culture, leadership, and branding. I also run Jaboa Miranda Foundation, which is a foundation that helps women who've been affected by suicide to get a university education and to learn how to cope with life setbacks. And I'm super excited to have you on this episode of In Her Blazer podcast. We have the amazing Usha Srinivasan, and she is the executive director of Ryerson Venture Zone in Brampton. And for those of you who don't know, it's super exciting and you want to get in on this immediately. She was the former chief of staff at Elevate, which is a huge, well-known tech conference in Toronto and Canada. And she's been in the tech industry many years, loved by everybody, and will be loved by you. So Usha, can you please introduce yourself to our fabulous listeners?
Hello, Jaboa. Thank you for asking me to be part of your podcast. Super excited to talk to your audience. So who's Usha? Like Jaboa said, I'm currently with Ryerson, leading this brand new spanking incubator in Brampton. And I'm super excited. We are launching on September 9th and love for you to participate there. But prior to that, I spent 10 years at Mars Discovery District, building some of the programming that all the startups in this province and Canada use, from online entrepreneurship education to market research services and so on. And prior to that, I was a market researcher at Frost & Sullivan. And prior to that, a researcher by training. I'm a scientist and environmental microbiologist. So I've had a few careers in my 50 years of life and pivoted over the years.
And you have a PhD. Usha is brilliant. So you know everything about everything, and everybody knows you and admires you in Toronto, and it should be in Canada and the world for that matter. So what made you want to become a leader? What made you want to aspire for more and to pursue your dreams and your goals in academia and in your corporate life and professional life?
Well, from academia perspective, I think from childhood, I've always been a science geek. I love science and all the intricacies of it. And so I did math science in high school, and it was easy transition to go into science in my bachelor program. But I really loved some of the work that I did in my early days of bachelor program. You know, when you do an honors bachelor's, you do a research project. So I was hooked, and I had more. And so that led me to do a PhD. I actually did a couple of more postdocs after that in different countries.
Wow.
The US and Canada.
Wow.
And so continuously improving on it. But, you know, life happens, and I did want to take a little bit of time to have my children. And so it was a little bit of a detour at that time to have a couple of kids. But that's when I really, you know, all the research that I had done was all about applied science. What I mean by that is it is directly relevant for industry, for application. And so my area of focus went from, you know, I love research, but I also wanted to know, what does that mean in business? How do you take that research ideas and application, and what does it mean in the business world? And the best way I could think of at that time was to be involved in the market research world. I didn't have the resources or time to go into an MBA with 2 toddlers. So I decided to learn business by doing. So I went into a company called Frost & Sullivan, and I learned a lot in the 8 years I worked there, working with multinationals and growing my profile in the corporate world through that work. But anyone who's listening who has been in the consulting world knows that it is a grind. It is a long hours and travel and billable hours. And at some point, I came to the realization that I need to understand what's happening in my local ecosystem. I was working with clients all across the US, but none in Canada. And so that's when I made the transition to come to Mars, which was focused on startups. This was the early days of Mars Discovery District, when people didn't know what Mars was. And I was employee number 25 there. And we were kind of making things up, you know, in terms of programming was everything from scratch, but that it's intoxicating to be in that environment where you're building everything from scratch, because there's nothing, no one has walked in your pathway before. And that's when I realized this is what I want to do. This is the going from a corporate setting where everything is laid out in a particular way to working in a startup environment. And I grew from there. So
where did that fire come from? Were your parents, was your mom that driven? Where'd that come from?
Likely so. I guess my father, and he was a pediatrician by training. And he has had his own first of many kind of things, the steps. He was one of the first delegates of doctors to go to Iran.
Wow.
In the 1970s. And when people are shy about moving outside of their ecosystem, my parents says, hey, new country, let's go explore. And he stayed there despite the Iran-Iraq war and danger to his life. He continued to stay there because he made a commitment to the hospital. So I guess I get a little bit of that adventurous spirit from my dad. And then he came to India, then we went to Dubai. So I have moved so many schools and so many homes as a child. I've never lived in one place for more than 3 years.
Wow.
And Toronto was the first place I could say that I lived for longer. And this is why this is home for me now.
Wow.
But I would never trade it for anything. I feel like being in new countries, new experiences helps shape you, grows you in ways that you can't even imagine. And so I'm very grateful for that experience.
Yeah, I agree with you. I haven't had the opportunity to move to different countries, but I moved around Canada quite a bit on my own. So lived on the West and then lived in Ottawa and then Montreal and here. So I am super grateful for that experience too. I think it opens your mind.
Absolutely.
And inadvertently, it does encourage you to become more adventurous.
Yeah, it does.
So yeah, it enriches your life. So that's very cool. Were you always a leader when you were growing up too?
I'm not sure. I felt always as a child I was in an adult in a child's body.
Yeah.
Yeah. How else to describe it? I was just, I was very quiet and very sure about what I wanted always. And every decision I've made, now thinking about it, even going to England to study, I was supposed to go and become a doctor, just like my dad. Long story short, lots of issues about foreign students studying in India at that time. And so my dad said, I'm sending you to England. Okay, figure out how that happens. And this is 1987, okay? There's no internet. There's no way to figure out what university applications look like. So there was, in my typewriter, I typed up letters and sent it out. And so when you ask that question, I think my parents also don't know, what possessed her? We you should go there. And then she decided to just do it. Get those applications, got into the university. And my dad basically said, if she spent that much time putting that effort into doing it, I'm going to, support her to go there.
Very cool.
It's just something I think it maybe comes from my dad and my ancestors. They've always been in leadership roles. They've been professors and lawyers and poets, some of them.
Very cool.
Literary critiques and so on.
That is awesome. That is very, very cool. I love that. That's very cool. When you were coming up through the ranks in your various workplaces and in your various roles, did you find yourself facing much adversity, especially compared to maybe some of your male counterparts?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I think, having confidence in what you do, a lot of women face this. You might have great ideas, you have things to contribute, but you always hesitate. You take a step back. You go and sit in the last chair in the room. You don't sit next to the table. These are all things that we just do unconsciously. And coming from an Asian kind of background, South Asian background, it's very normal to take a backseat to men. It's very normal to do that. And it was no different in the corporate setting. I have to say, I have been blessed to be among some amazing leaders, especially at Mars, like Ilse Turnicht, our past CEO, other individuals, Charles Plant, Tony Redpath, who really pushed me to be my best self because they had more confidence in me than I had in myself. And so I think there's one situation you will find it hard to believe when they asked me to move from a director to managing director role and take over all of the business acceleration program. It was a step up. I declined it first.
What? Why?
I declined, saying, there is no way I'm taking this role. My colleagues are then now going to be reporting to me. I don't feel comfortable. I'm not ready.
Wow.
It was the lack of confidence in myself. And they said, okay, fine, we won't push you. 2 months went by. They came back again.
Wow.
They said, no, it's external candidates make no sense. You know the most. You are the senior most. You are doing this. And particularly this gentleman, Tony Radpath, he's like the mentor we all go to. He's retired now. He's such an amazing individual. And he said, I'm right beside you. I'm going to help you, coach you. We'll be fine. And so where do you get that? I am so blessed to have gotten that. But then that's when I found myself over the years that, wait a second, people are believing in me. I need to step up. I pushed myself and my limits, and I started sitting more closer to the table. I started speaking up. I started engaging more actively. And so it was a process. It took over a period of time in that 10 years to be more. And people had reverse reaction. Some people like, I can't believe she said that. But, that's good too, to be vocal and just express your concerns. But I think what I always felt grounded in helping entrepreneurs. I always wanted to be the voice for the entrepreneurs. And because I was authentic, people did not mind my bold comments. And so, yeah.
That is very cool and very, very lucky to have that experience. And listeners, do you hear how in demand Usha is? They're begging her to get promoted. This is the value in Usha. People beg her. That is
very surreal for sure. That was like a strange moment for me.
That is very cool. Very, very cool. I know those opportunities don't happen often, especially to women. And when they do happen, they stand out for a lifetime. And one of the opportunities not at all similar to you, never, but I remember when I was working at GE in marketing in Montreal, and I was 21, 22. And I remember something so simple. I had just come into the meeting and I was bringing my boss, he was an SVP at the time. I was bringing him his laptop and I walked into the room and I said, hello to everybody, and like made a joke because like I burst into the room. And then after the meeting ended, the former CFO of General Electric, Manjit Sharma, amazing woman. She came up to me and she's like, I love your confidence. She's like, you don't see that often, but don't ever lose that.
Yes.
And I didn't understand at the time, but that always stuck with me. Mm-hmm. And then as you grow older, you realize that is an issue amongst women as a lack of confidence.
Yeah.
And so I just remember it's like little moments like that just kind of push you to keep going and never lose that part of yourself. So it's that little part of yourself, those little moments that push you to hold on to that piece of you and to never let it go and run with it, that fire.
Yeah.
So so that's very cool. So moving into the startup world and launching a startup, before going from concept to full-time startup, what would you recommend potential founders to do? What steps should they take to help them increase their chances of becoming successful when they actually take the leap and go out full-time into the startup world?
Mm-hmm. I'm sure some of your listeners probably heard this before, but a lot of times when startups have come to Mars, etc., the mistake they always make is they fall in love with the solution. You have to fall in love with the problem. That is the only way you're going to build the best product. Being a scientist myself, I'm respectfully saying to other scientists, this is what they do. They fall in love with this thing that they found and it's amazing. And they haven't thought about who's going to pay for it, who's going to buy it. How much is it going to cost to build it? They think about none of that, but they just love the solution. I think we can't sweep everybody with the same kind of a brush. So when it's a highly technology-focused, high intellectual property-focused kind of innovation in the science space, yes, it does come from a lab and something happened and they accidentally found something, versus if it's an app-based software, they're much more connected to the customer base because there's Maybe it's B2C in a lot of times, or direct to consumer or direct to the business. But in all circumstances, important to really be grounded on the problem you're trying to solve. Is this something that people are going to pay for? And am I going to add value and impact to this particular segment? That's important, number one. And then it's the willingness to iterate and make mistakes and learn and be coachable, right? If you are not coachable, you can't move forward, because if you think you know everything, you are the expert, and you don't listen to your investors or your experts or customers, you're going to not move forward. This is why we always say an idea is a dime a dozen. Execution is all that matters. You can keep coming up with ideations, but at the end of the day, do you have the stamina and the patience to listen and grow and change and move forward with your idea? So those are some immediate things that come to mind.
I love that.
For entrepreneurs.
I love that. So with women, especially jumping into entrepreneurships, do you think they'll face different hardships than men potentially? And if you do, what are some examples of some of these hardships they might face and ways to mitigate them, to keep encouraging them to press forward and continue with their startup and their business and make it on their own?
There's so many layers of impediments, difficulties for women entrepreneurs. If you're a young woman entrepreneur, I have sadly heard some women entrepreneurs who say they're not taken seriously. They have gotten some unwanted attention and things that they have tried to the extreme of. They have also had to think about how they dress in order to keep that attention away, which is very sad to hear from younger women who have tried to grow a startup. And then at a certain age group, this inevitable thing in women's life, if you are wanting to be in the family side, being married, to having children, it takes away some time from your focus. Yes, you could do it all, but I'm of the opinion, and this is the best quote that I have ever heard from our previous CEO at Mars, Ilse Turnicht, that your life journey is like a marathon. You're not going to get everything you want at the same time. You have to relish at individual different times of your life. Different things are going to be heightened and less, and that is not a bad thing. Maybe 2 years of your life, you spend amazing time with your children. Nothing wrong with that. And then you move on to another chapter. So when we think that having it all doesn't mean having it all at the same time. Having it all at different times of your phase, when your body is ready to do certain things versus others, or your mind is ready to do certain things, or your experience is ready to do certain things. So I think I take that makes most realistic sense to me as an individual, as a woman, that how I think about the impediments. It's not impediments. It's just really your choices that you as a woman are making about, I'm focused on this right now. I'm going to focus on something else after this phase, perhaps. But when you are at the later stages, sometimes inevitably, since you've taken some time off to have children, and it happened to me, I couldn't work or chose not to work full-time. At least I was never not working. I was always working, even as a consultant. There is a gap, right? There, you have to catch up, and then you've missed equivalent to a man who had been in the same position. Perhaps they moved further in their career because you've taken a gap. And then also, when you are at that certain age group, sometimes your being aggressive is mistaken for something else. And you've heard many women talk about this, I think, in the past. And either if you're too passive, you're seen as not strong. If you're too aggressive, there's lots of judgments made about how you behave. Yeah. And networks are different. I think your listeners, I'm sure, have heard about women leaders finding investors is extremely hard to do because most of the investment community is dominated by men. There are a few amazing women leaders like Janice Bannister, who runs Real Ventures, for example, but there are Michelle McBain, who runs a funding program in Mars IAF. There are far and few. Neha Kara from Founder Startup and so on. But still, they are not in the masses, right? And so as a women founder, you're going to We've heard some horrific stories from women entrepreneurs have gone for investment, have said, we will invest in you if you're willing to step down and we bring in some more seasoned person.
Whoa.
As a CEO. We've heard, I've heard these kinds of comments from women leaders. I think we're doing better, baby steps. And then I can add another layer of, being a ethnic minority woman adds another layer of complexities. And so I think we just work through it. I think we're resilient. Women are resilient. We work through those challenges and make our own pathways of how we want to grow as leaders. And there's no right or wrong way. I think my own decision of leaving Mars and becoming a co-founder of startup, I think most people were very positive about that decision, and a few others were shocked with that decision. They felt, wow, taking a risk at this age.
Wow. Wow.
There was some judgment.
Wow.
But 90% very positive. Made total sense for them that I was going to do this.
Wow. And we will touch on the investment piece because I think that's a very important piece in the startup game. Before we do that, though, if someone is considering jumping into the startup world full time, how much money do you think they should have saved in the bank? What kind of runway should they need? And what is your point of view on burn rate? Where should that be kept at? And what is the ratio?
Yeah. So a couple of different things to think about here. The industry that they are in is very important to think. It plays a huge role in deciding if they really need the level of investment. If you are in the clean tech space, healthcare space, these tend to be high investment areas. Meaning there is no way you could survive with angel investment. Your Series A rounds are going to be so much higher, or seed rounds are going to be so much higher because it is the hardware and the technology costs and the research costs are so much more onerous. And so the good news is there are lots of public sector grant programs that Canada offers. It is very cumbersome to write the applications, et cetera, but it's worth the funding if you are in a pure science-based kind of industry to have as much non-dilutive funding as possible to get you moving. Okay. And so at some point, and it takes a long time for those kinds of businesses to come to market because there's so much intellectual property that they have to develop, and they might be associated with a university. They have to, the testing might take longer. If it's life sciences, lots of clinical trials. It takes so much long to make that into a possibility, and lots of effort and time, but heavily focused on public sector funding.
Okay.
And then very much down the line, really think about how you want to bring in corporate funding or VC funding. However, the other part of the equation, the software side, whether it's an app or web-based or software as a service, those kinds of companies, time to market is very important. They move fast. They need to decide things quickly. And it's very normal for them to go into lots of angel investment and get equity funds sooner.
What does angel investment funding mean? What is that? What is an angel investor for those of our listeners who don't quite know?
Sorry, I should explain that. So typically when we say angel investors, they tend to be individuals who are high net worth individuals looking to invest in your company. And angel investments, maybe it could be lower range. It could be anything from $50K to even $200K, very rarely very high. So they're smaller investments in your business, and it's good funding for a short period of time, right? And eventually you need a higher amount of capital for us to grow, for those companies to grow faster. There is a gentleman by the name of Charles Plant. He has written a lot about how our companies in Canada, he's from U of T. He has written a lot about how our Canadian companies don't take enough money. They should be more aggressive about investing more initially so that they can grow faster.
Really?
Yes, he should be in your podcast next.
All right. That's awesome.
He was my boss. He was my boss at Mars.
Oh, no way. Okay.
for a short period of time, and still a very good friend. But he has written some interesting papers around how do we create unicorns. You know, the unicorns are companies that have $1 billion valuation. and how the investment profile of our companies are different from the US companies. So he'll make a fascinating podcast for sure. And so depending on the industry, you have to think about different types of investments. So your question is around run rate, how much you have saved. The thing is, when you are in a science-based kind of space, you should be able to, you get enough money to invest in your company. But for your own livelihood, right, as an individual, very few funding or bodies invest in you. Invest in the company, yes, but not in you. So there are lots of restrictions. That's when the entrepreneurs have a difficult time. In cases where they are a postdoc or a PhD student, they have funding to sustain themselves because they're in the research arm. But if they came from industry and they're trying to do this on their own, it is very difficult to. So I would imagine if they are in a stage where they are having a family unit, maybe there's a person that's full-time employed when other person is taking a risk of taking cut in their salaries, or have a healthy TFSA. I myself had planned giving myself a year. Let's see what happens with this. Or if you have the opportunity to work 70% in another full-time job, which is what I did. With Elevate, I took a shorter role so that I could spend 30% of my time on my business. So there are so many different models. I recently actually heard from an entrepreneur that he's working full-time so that his co-founder can focus on the business. Wow. And they live together in one house so that they're sharing their cost.
Wow.
People are doing all kinds of sacrifices and all kinds of models to make it work.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's a tricky game. And it's interesting though. So for the government grants that often support new entrepreneurs in Canada, do some of those grants cover their living costs, or is that strictly for the business as well?
It's usually for the business. There are a few that I actually used to run in Mars called Embedded Executive. That was for an employee that you bring on board. But at the early stages, typically it's for the technology development. Okay. And also, there will be some entrepreneurs, later stage entrepreneurs will say, you know what, just find your customers and bootstrap and just get funding going from people. You might not make any profit, but whatever you get, you just use it as a way to grow your business. That's one way for a software business, but not for hard science. It's hard to do that. You need a lot more capital. What
would you say are some skills that entrepreneurs should or need to develop before they jump into the deep end of startup life?
I find they are going to be okay with the risk. They're okay with ambiguity. There's no pathway. You have come up with this net new idea that you're going to launch. You have to be extremely positive, be an optimist. I haven't found a single entrepreneur who is a pessimist. That's no work. So an optimistic kind of fire in your belly type of attitude is the only way you're going to make it. You never quit. Never quit. Whatever happens, keep going.
You hear that? You hear that, listeners? Never quit. Keep going with your business. Even when it feels like you're drowning a little, just push on a little longer. You'll get there. And this concludes part 1 of a 2-part series on launching a startup with Usha Srinivasan, the queen of startups. If you want to tune in next week on Wednesday, September 16th, you can hear part 2 of the 2-part series and find out how to contact the incredibly amazing Usha. And for those of you who are wanting to get in contact with me, feel free to visit my website at jaboamiranda.ca, send me an email to info@jaboamiranda, or add me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Twitter at jaboamiranda. And if you love this podcast episode, and I hope you do, feel free to leave us a review. We would really, really appreciate it on Apple Podcasts. So as always, have an incredible day. Bye, everybody.